Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Japanese beetle webinar. My name is Cassie Chihorse, and I am an outreach specialist at the Washington State Department of Agriculture. I'm happy to have you on with us today, and we will be hosting this webinar in partnership with Washington State University Extension. Just a couple things before we get started. This webinar is being recorded as well as being streamed to YouTube Live. For that purpose and better streaming quality, we ask that you turn your video off if possible. Also, if you keep yourselves muted, it'll help the feedback and help the presenters speak more clearly as this webinar continues. There'll be several presenters today, including Sven Spieshiger and myself from the Washington State Department of Agriculture Pest Program, Benita Matheson from the Nursery Program, and Gwen Hoysel from Washington State University Extension. On the side, there's a chat box. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. We may answer them as we go along, and then at the end, there'll be time for questions and answers. If at that time you're using the chat box, you can also use the raise your hand function, and then we will allow you to unmute yourself and ask that question further. So with that being said, I will go ahead and turn the webinar over to Sven, and he'll give you a little background on the Japanese beetle program.
Right. Good afternoon, and thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Sven Spieshiger, and I am the managing entomologist for the Washington State Department of Agriculture Pest Program. I came here about 3 years ago now, and before that, I was the state entomologist in Pennsylvania for about 20 years, I guess, before I retired and came here for the same job. So I haven't met a lot of you yet, but I certainly would love to get to know everybody as time goes by here. I think it's very important that we all work together on projects like this. And so I'm going to give you just a little overview on how we've been treating Japanese beetle here in Washington State, at least since I've been here. Leah, next slide, please. So a little bit about the Japanese beetle program. Japanese beetle is a scarab beetle that is native to Japan, as the name implies, and it feeds on over 300 types of plants. It was first found, they believe, associated with bulbs for nursery stock near Riverton, New Jersey in 1916. And since that time, it has slowly spread and become established in about half of the country. You can see here on the official National Agriculture Information Portal map that, you know, it's about as far as the Mississippi River. And then there's a lot of states that are colored green here in the western part of the country that have some spot detections here and there. And you'll see a bunch of brown patches, and that means they're being eradicated. So basically speaking, we've done a pretty good job keeping it out of here through inspections, through spot eradication programs and other things like that. And so I think it's very important for folks to know that it's still a battle that's worth fighting, and we're trying to kind of move along and make sure that this one gets wiped out as well. Leah, next slide, please.
Sven, I'm just going to interrupt momentarily. This webinar is being streamed live on YouTube. If you happen to be watching on YouTube, feel free to put questions in the YouTube live chat, and we will get those questions over to our presenters.
Great, thanks, Cassie. All right, so Japanese beetle spreads usually pretty slowly naturally, but it also spreads by hitchhiking, and this is how it can make huge leaps across the country, and of course, from Japan to the United States originally. As an adult, it can move many miles on airplanes, trucks, trains, or ships, things like that. And as a larvae, it can spread in the soil of potted plants, compost, or fill. Next, please. Western states like Washington actually conduct annual Japanese beetle surveys to detect and eliminate populations before they become established. Here in Washington State, official surveys began in the early 1990s, and this was to support the passage of a state Japanese beetle quarantine. Next, please. And It may not come as a surprise to you, but over the years, by focusing on known pathways for introduction, Washington State has detected Japanese beetle in places you might suspect, in Clark, King, Pierce, Snohomish, Spokane, and most recently in Yakima County. Generally, these are associated with air cargo or some type of freight coming from the East Coast. And generally, it doesn't amount to much. It's usually one or two specimens, and a established population is not a result of the introduction. And you can see this is a map I pulled down from NAPAS, which is our National Agricultural Reporting System. And you can see that we have a couple of areas under eradication, and we've recently added Yakima County. And you can see that Clark County, we had an infestation years ago, which was eradicated, and they have popped up periodically in Pierce and Spokane. And we seem to always get them near the airports up in King and Snohomish. Next, please. So in 2020, we followed sort of the same strategy of targeting known introduction pathways, and we had about 1,600 Japanese beetle traps throughout Washington State. About halfway through the season, we got kind of an anomaly when we got a detection in one of our traps in Sunnyside in Yakima County. As a result of this, we deployed more traps in the area. And unfortunately, as we were pulling those in at the end of the season, one trap in Grandview ended up having 2 specimens in it. And this is cause for concern. Next, please. So because of this, we met in November and determined what our next course of action would be. And of course, we knew we needed to increase outreach in the area. And part of that in February of 2021 was doing a small little spotlight during the National Invasive Species Week, where we solicited reports of Japanese beetle. And this effort actually paid off immediately and resulted in a report from a Grandview resident that suggested a breeding population. Next, please. The report detailed specimens having been seen in 2019 on eggplant in the resident's garden, and then just an explosion in 2020 where on certain days the individual was able to pick 75 beetles off of her roses. She also detailed walking around the neighborhood, going in about a 1-mile circle and seeing similar damage on all of the plants in the area. She was kind enough and bright enough actually to snap some photographs as proof, which was just awesome, because instead of us doing a delimiting survey in the area to try to figure out how bad it was, this resident took the time to report it and kind of put us ahead of the curve for 2021. And so what we need to do here in 2021, of course, is increase outreach, and that's what we're taking part in here today. Of course, we need to provide training for residents to recognize, report, and if at all possible, to control infestations on their own property. And it's a big ask of folks, but anything we might do officially as an agency can't happen in 2021. There's a little bit of paperwork associated with doing that. And so we want to at least let everybody know about the tools that are available. And anybody who's able to help out on their own, we want to encourage them to do so. And then, of course, our primary goal is to determine the extent of the current introduction. And that's really what we need to come away from in 2021. And with that, I'm going to turn you back over to Cassie, and she's going to go ahead and tell you a little bit about Japanese beetle.
Next slide, please. So I'm going to tell you the life cycle of Japanese beetle, what the larvae and the adults look like. Then at the very end, I will show you some other adult beetles you might see out in the summer when Japanese beetle is out. So right now, as temperatures are rising and we're closer into the springtime, the grubs are waking up. And when they wake up, they're hungry and they eat. Their primary food source is grass roots, with them being underneath the ground. They're eating the roots, but they're also known to eat the roots of shrubs, ornamental plants, garden vegetables, and other vegetation. And they kind of need a combination of things along with those food sources, including kind of the proper soil type and moisture. So as those food sources kind of deplete, they may move around and find other grass roots or other roots of plants and vegetables to eat. Following that, they're going to turn into a pupae. And then as the summer months come around, those pupae are going to hatch into those adult Japanese beetles, which you see in the middle picture. The beetles will emerge from underground and they'll start to deskeletonize and eat the foliage of plants and flowers. As they're eating, they're going to mate and then they'll return to the soil and lay eggs and then come back up to the surface and eat some more. Right? They're going to do this throughout the summer. And then as the summer lays into fall, the adult beetles will become deceased and those eggs that they laid will start to hatch and turn back into those grubs. And the grubs, like we know, are going to continue to eat and feast. Next slide, please. So what do those grubs or their larvae look like? They're described as being white in a C shape. Their head tends to be brown to tan, and you can see the legs on it, typically about 1/8 of an inch to 1 inch long. And again, you'll see these in the spring, but remember, they'll be below the soil or be below the surface. The last thing I want to mention about is it's hard to distinguish from other larvae. Sometimes the only way you can tell if they're Japanese beetle larvae is by examining the pattern of the spines on the hair of the other side and on the tip of the abdomen. Next slide, please. So from this picture, you can see the majority of their lifetime is spent underground versus that time they spend overground. However, that time that they do spend above ground can be destructive. And they will eat and feast. Just because you can take care of the Japanese beetles in your lawn doesn't mean that your neighbor's adult beetles might come over as well. Next slide. So what do these adult beetles look like? They're around 1/3 of an inch to 1/2 an inch long. If you look towards that head, it's kind of that metallic-y green color into their thorax, but above that they have copper wing covers, copper colored. If you look at the sides and the tip, you kind of see these white furry things sticking out, and they're actually white patches of hairs. There's going to be 5 on the sides and 2 on the tip. And remember, you'll see these adult beetles during the summer. Next slide. So during that time, you might also see other beetles. And what are a couple of these? On the left, I have the blue milkweed beetle. It gets its name because its host plant, what it likes to eat, is milkweed. You'll see them kind of May through September. They're found in the western United States, about a little bit under 1/2 an inch, and they have that bright metallic-y blue color and tend to be oval shaped. On the right, I have a flower chafer. You'll find them around flowers. They tend to be brick to light brown colored in that oval shape again, about 1/2 an inch long. These were originally discovered in 2001 in British Columbia, about 15 miles from the Washington border. Next slide. Green pine chafers on the left tend to have an elongated, flattened body. They tend to be metallic-y green in color, but they might also iridesce to be kind of brownish, about 1/3 of an inch long, and they like to eat the tender portions of leaves or needles. On the right, I have a little bear beetle, and it gets its name because if you look at it, you see some woolly fuzz in its adult stage. About 1/3 of an inch to 3/4 of an inch long. They'll emerge in the spring. They're known to kind of target sagebrush, but it will also feed on various blossoms, buds, and leaves, including ones from apple and peach trees. Next slide. Here I have a blister beetle. On the left, it's about 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch. You might be seeing these a little bit earlier in the spring. They're found throughout North America. They tend to be green to blue to black in color. On the right, I have a Klamath weed beetle. The adults are about oblong in shape, 1/4 of an inch. Their head, if you notice, it's going to point downwards. Tends to be metallic-y color, blue to bronze to green to purple. And they were initially introduced to California to control the Klamath weed. That's how they get their name. Next slide. So my last slide, got grubs. You might not always be able to see all of the insects because remember the grubs and the larvae are under the ground, but you might see some of the damage they create. The same with your plants, how they deskeletonize the foliage. Also, a quick note is if you see this deskeletonization, but you don't see the insect, maybe look under the plant. If disturbed, the Japanese beetles tend to fall off. So with that being said, I'm going to pass the presentation off so you can learn a little bit more about the impacts. Benita, if you want to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Cassie. Hi, I'm Benita Matheson, and I'm with the Plant Services program with WSDA, and I just wanted to talk to you guys about the potential impacts to Washington State if a Japanese beetle were to become established here in specifically Yakima County. So that's not only going to impact people's gardens, turf grass, it's also going to impact our local farms, our grape industry, our hops industry, and also affect us being able to export out of the state, and also any quarantines that might be put on Washington State by other states to ship. Next slide. So for just, gardeners, you're going to notice that Japanese beetles are very destructive to your ornamental plants. And even though those healthy plants can take some feeding, the mature trees and shrubs, they can take a little bit of that feeding without significant long-term injury, but you will see that the blossoms will be ruined, and the overall appearance of those plants will be ruined. And also young and unhealthy plants could be stunted, injured, or even killed from severe persistent feeding. Next slide. And so here's a list of some primary and secondary plants that are susceptible to Japanese beetle feeding. As you can see, a lot of our major crops are going to be on this list. Apples, plums, apricots, cherries, peaches. Yakima County is the #1 county of exporting all of these fruit trees and fruit products. So having Japanese beetle be established within this county would really impact our industries. Next slide. And here's a list of herbaceous plants that are susceptible to the adult Japanese beetle feeding. On this, you can also see that grape, sweet corn, asparagus, red raspberry, these are all things that are being farmed in Yakima County. And these are primary and secondary hosts, but that does not mean that the Japanese beetle is going to stop once it eats all of these, this plant material. They will feed on other plants. These are just what they prefer. So it's really important to note that Japanese beetle isn't going to be just destructive to our industries. It's going to be destructive to homeowners. There's a lot of ornamental plants on this list, and that's going to affect the nurseries that are also selling plants within the area. Next slide. So we also have a turf grass industry in Eastern Washington, and Japanese beetle grubs like to feed on that turf grass, and they'll be right under the roots feeding. And on the left, you can see the early signs of Japanese beetle, and it kind of looks like you're maybe not watering your grass so much, but if you were to pull that back, you would be able to see the grubs there. And then on the right-hand side, you would see the severe Japanese beetle damage to that turf, which is really, you're not going to be able to salvage that if it becomes infested with Japanese beetle. Next slide. So what's it going to do to our farm and our nurseries if Japanese beetle were to become established in Yakima County? So fruits and vegetables and herbs can tolerate a limited feeding, but the severe damage is going to affect the plant growth and reduce the yield of our crops in Yakima County specifically, where we have this find. Next slide. So just to give you an idea of the impact to our exports, Yakima County currently has 3,143 farms in the area. Yakima County is also the leading county in, as I said, apples, sweet cherries, pears. They also, they're the leading producer of squash, summer and winter, and also the highest concentration of wineries. And then we are the #1 county in Yakima producing hops. So it's a really big impact if we were to have an established Japanese colony in that county. Next slide. And so currently Washington State is listed as a Category 1 state. And so what that means is that Japanese beetle, we're not affected by any restrictions regarding Japanese beetle. So we're free to ship any of our products out of state without any restrictions. And so if we were to have that change, we could potentially have restrictions put upon us by Oregon, California, Idaho, who are all Category 1 states. It could affect our shipments to British Columbia and, you know, any other of our exporting countries like the EU, Japan, China, Korea, and Mexico. So that just kind of gives you a little bit more information that this pest is very destructive, and it could make a big impact on our agriculture community. And with that, I think that's my last slide.
Hi, so now that you know a little bit about Japanese beetle and what can happen in Washington, I'm going to let you know how, as citizens, you can help. So obviously, if you suspect to have seen Japanese beetle, the thing you should do is report it. There's a couple different ways you can report. You can go to our website, agr.wa.gov/beetles, send an email to the pest program, which is pestprogram@agr.wa.gov, or call our hotline 1-800-443-6684. Remember, you probably won't be seeing Japanese beetles until the summertime, but if you happen to see any beetles or have any pictures from last year, go ahead and report those to us because we'll still take a look. Next slide. And if someone brings a Japanese beetle into a plant clinic, go ahead and report that as well. Again, report it to the Washington State Department of Agriculture. A couple other things we do is we have a Japanese beetle Facebook group, and you can also follow us on Instagram and Twitter as well. The last thing I'm going to mention is our stakeholder updates, and these are PDFs that will come to your email with anything new in the Japanese beetle program and different ways to keep you informed on what the WSDA is doing. So all you have to do is go to the website, and then on the main page, you're just going to scroll down until you see a section that says Stay Informed. There's a hyperlink that says Join the Pest Program email listserv. You click on that. It'll take you to a new page where you can enter in your email address, click the box for Japanese beetle, and hit subscribe. Once you do that, you'll be signed up to receive those emails about Japanese beetle when we send them out periodically. Next slide. And with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Gwen with Washington State University Extension. Before I do that, though, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to everyone that's watching on YouTube Live. And remember, if you have any questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat box as we go.
Perfect. Thank you. So I'm going to go over control recommendations. And this isn't very different than what our Master Gardener training and handbook typically says anyway. There will be a slight modification, and I'm going to give you very specific chemical controls in that we typically recommend softest chemical to none. And in this case, you heard Sven talk about that the goal of this is eradication. We don't want to let this get established. And Benita talked about the effects on a commercial industry. So us as master gardeners, volunteers who are giving out advice to the public on chemical control, the ones I picked are the ones that are shown to be generally the most effective. They're not always the softest. So we'll go through that. But the first steps are detect, identify, report, and treat. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so there are multiple pheromone traps that are approved for the state of Washington. They will be sold in some of the like local feed stores, and you can pick them up there. You basically put the trap out, hang it up, and it's a pheromone trap. You should look inside there and actually look to see if you have adult beetles, but this is an easy way for you to be able to detect them. And you can recommend it to other people if they're nervous and don't know how to look for it or if they'll miss it. This is a good way. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so now you're going to detect it. So you can detect grubs or adults. So remember, after watering begins, look at brown spots in the lawn. And I know this is a statewide presentation to Master Gardeners. So on the west side, you have a little more just natural precipitation. So your lawns may be greener just naturally, but on the east side, right now we have a lot of patches of different types of fescue and such that are brown. So you don't want people to go out and start digging up, but they can just about now. Irrigation is on and they can turn it on. And if the grass doesn't green up and you have these patches of brown spots, you basically take a shovel and they can dig just right under the surface and peel the sod back. And if you see small C-shaped grubs, that might be a concern. That being said, there are many types of grubs besides. You saw many of the lookalikes. There are other grubs than just this Japanese beetle that are also C-shaped. But look for that first. So next slide. Okay, in a couple months, you'll be able to see adults. And so Cassie already went over this on how to look for it, but a review, you're going to be copper and green and these 5 white patches on the side. So I know I've already gotten emails or text pictures of that little bear beetle where it's very pubescent, very furry and hairy. So identification is going to be key. So you have your resources within WSU. We also, Department of Ag, at one of the other meetings said they too will identify it. So if samples get brought in to plant clinics and or whenever they're allowed to open again in your region and or you find them, proper identification is to start. You're going to see the adults in the midsummer again, and the grubs are going to be spring and fall. Okay, next slide. Okay, so eradication is the effort. Before I go into pest control recommendations, I just want to make that clear. And to report this, I'm putting this website back up there. There'll be another slide of it at the end. The reports don't come to me. If you get formal reports through the Master Gardener clinics or you find them in your house, you need to report them to Department of Ag. Okay, next slide. Perfect. Okay, so now treatment is a little tricky, but makes sense when we think about the Japanese beetle life cycle. So I want to say you're going to have to know when you're treating. Chemicals are very specific for what life stage the beetle is at. So you have to know if you're going to have big grubs, which basically is January and May, or if you started in November, December, January, February, March, April, May. So you have bigger grubs. Or is it towards the fall, right? So the adults have emerged, they've come out, and in the fall, August, September, October, the adults have gone back into the soil, laid little eggs and little grubs. That's a different type of treatment versus, again, the foliage with the adult. So keep that life cycle in mind because I'm going to have some charts on the next page that will help you go through on what time of year it is and what to treat. Okay, next slide. All right. So May to mid-July, you see that in the next slide, you're going to see a green table, and you want to treat with something that's called a preventative insecticide. And that's because you are going to apply in the soil, and it's going to be there ready for the Japanese beetle to lay their eggs back again. So if you see adults and it's been confirmed, then you would lay this preventative if it's between May and July, and the adults will lay their eggs in the soil, and you're going to treat those little eggs and little grubs. If someone brings you a sample and you've missed that time window, right? Then you need to have an insecticide that's called a curative insecticide. It basically is a contact insecticide to hit the big grubs. So certain things will work on little, certain things will work on big. And that's going to be in a blue table on the next slide. Adults, it's a totally different suite of chemicals as well. And you can also, the one recommendation that is pretty easy, you can always take any insect and put it in a bucket of soapy water, right? Okay, so next slide. All right, so before you make recommendations, there's a lot in our training on proper pesticide use. We need to make sure that we follow it again here. So on the label, you're going to be able to see is Japanese beetle on the label, and it will often say after it, Japanese beetle adult or Japanese beetle grub. And so just make sure that you're treating the grub or larva and that Japanese beetle's on the label, but then remind people to and look for how to use, how much, how often, make sure they're going to follow the instructions and what to wear. So just remind people proper safety and proper use. So in the tables coming up, there's going to be some icons. And so in this gray box at the bottom, I'm just showing them to you now. The little bee with the slash across it is don't apply when bees are present. These insecticides are not safe for bees. There's one where it says, please don't apply when butterfly or butterfly larvae are present. So if you are growing a butterfly garden, do not choose that insecticide. And then I also listed a few organic options and then ones that were also safer for bees. So next slide. Okay, so we have these red tables. We have these tables. There is a handout that we've posted already on the Benton Franklin website. And we can share that link also with other coordinators, Master Gardener coordinators, to make sure that you have this handout where these tables are. So don't feel like you have to write all this down. I've already written it down in a single page format for you. So the goal that you need to do that if you're making a chemical recommendation out of your plant clinic, then you can tell people, look at the red table. This is the time of year you are, or look at the blue or look at the green. However, you're going to have to spend a little bit of time teaching them about active ingredient. There's a lot of products that are out there, and some of them are just ineffective. And remember, our goal is eradication. So I have recommended the ones that have the best success treatment or success to them. So this is how I usually explain active ingredients, is that it's the difference between Advil versus ibuprofen. So Advil is your trade name, your market name. So in the table, it's the all-in-one roses and flower concentrate, vegetable and garden insect spray. It's just the name of, the brand name of what's going out there. Ibuprofen comes in many forms. It can be in the Safeway brand, it can be in Advil, it can be in many forms. Ibuprofen is the actual ingredient that is in that medicine. because there are so many choices in every different store. The best way to pick your chemical is to look at the active ingredient. Now, you as an educator have a great way. This is a great opportunity to teach people about all kinds of things. So this education is not any different than what you would use in weed care and other fungicide care. But look at the active ingredient and then go look at the product and make sure that that active ingredient is on that product, right? So I've listed several active ingredients here that you would apply for control of adult beetles. And then the other one at the bottom, beetle juice, is an organic. It's a Bacillus thuringiensis, so it's a BT product. That one you want to make sure you're not putting on your butterfly garden. Okay? So next slide. All right, so you're going to teach them again to match, and these pictures are on the handouts. You're going to match the active ingredient in the table with the one on the product you're using. You can show them this picture that in the yellow box square, there's the list of active ingredients. There's a whole lot of other active ingredients on all these homeowner products. This one has 2 separate lists of active ingredients. The first one is a fungicide. It's okay, it's there. But the second one is imidacloprid. That is in this list of adult beetle control. As long as there is one, they don't have to know what all the others are for, but since this is an all-in-one rose and flower treatment, the all-in-one means it's going to control diseases and insects. So as long as one of them is in that list that you're going to find in the tables, that's acceptable. Okay, next slide. Okay, so from May to mid-July, you're going to do a preventative. It kills the eggs and little grubs. You're going to apply it on the lawn in July and August before adults lay eggs in the soil. And the one recommendation here is to mow the lawn first, because on these we would, on many of these, we'd like to make sure that they're, except for grub X, that you don't have a lot of bees coming to your dandelions or any other flowering weeds that are in your lawn. Okay, next slide. All right, so there will be a blue table. Remember, that's curative, so it's going to hit the big grubs. So if anybody comes later in the fall, you know, and they say, oh, I didn't quite get to it. Or next year, you can say from September to May, they could apply anything that's in this blue table. One way to sometimes see the difference between them is those preventatives will sometimes have these key words, key marketing words that say season-long control. These have quick 24-hour control, instant, those kinds of things that they say on it. It's going to have many products in there that, again, I'm asking if you will recommend for people to mow their lawn first to avoid flowering weeds. Okay, and then for this one, the grub halt, that is the Bacillus thuringiensis, I put a special note there for you, was to apply this from mid-July to mid-August. It just takes a little bit of a different, needs a little bit different time, right? Okay. So, oh, good. And someone, Carla, put in the chat room, there's also a website there for where this treatment recommendations are. So next slide, please. Okay, so remember, we want to detect it first. You can give people recommendations on how to find them or detect them. Please do not just take someone's cell phone picture and tell them that this is exactly what it is. If someone sends you something, then great, ask them to bag it or put it in soapy water. And it can be reported to Department of Ag, but we first wanted to trap or collect it. You get it identified and then report it to Department of Ag, and treat. Next. I think this is the last one. So the resources. So again, I'm leaving these resources up there with where to report through Department of Ag. And then the Master Gardener Extension, I put, because we're in Benton, Franklin counties and Yakima counties, I put our extension offices on this slide because the first large find was in Grandview, but all of you have your own extension offices that you can go and also get, I mean, you know them. You're always welcome to email me a question, and my email is there. There is one the website here with Japanese Benton Franklin, the handout is the one that will have the chemical control recommendations. But there is one Japanese beetle homeowner handbook, and I know that it was advertised on a few other slides in case you didn't pick it up. You should write this down. And I really like it if you get a if you're more curious about it, what kinds of host plants. This is a very, very thorough book made by USDA APHIS. The only contradiction I have or warning I want to recommend to you guys is that Japanese beetle is very prominent in other parts of Eastern US. And you know, we say often, if you can't find information on pest sense or hort sense, then the next best thing is to go to another .edu recommendation. In this case, we are putting out a pest sense and hort sense or a hort sense publication fairly quickly on this one. But on this one, I want to make sure that you take information that's from this handbook for biological information or from our homeowner control option page that's here. Many other states are not in the focus of eradication. Of we're going to, how do we control it and how is it going through the system? So if you read things from New Jersey Extension or Colorado Extension, they're going to give you somewhat more open and different advice and how to have a whole IPM program surrounding this. But that's not where we are. We would like to stop this bug from taking hold within Washington state. Okay. So in this case, the hort sense should get published relatively soon, as soon as I can get that completed and take the information from WSU and this APHIS book. Okay. So, and I think that's the last slide of this that we're able to take questions, right?
Yeah, thanks, Gwen. We will now take questions, like she said. You can ask questions by putting them in the chat box, or you can use the raise your hand function, and I'll take you off mute. Also, if you're on the YouTube live, feel free to put questions in the chat box and we'll get them over to presenters here. So we have a question. Exactly where in King and Snohomish County have beetles been detected? Are they breeding populations?
I can go ahead and get that, Cassie. So exactly where is basically at the airport. So we have detections at SeaTac almost every year. They are associated with a major supplier of household goods that ships all over the country that is similar to Amazon, if you will, right near their hangar. And the airport is aware of these. We get 1 or 2 hits every year. One year, it seemed like we were getting more in the airport self-treated, and then in Snohomish and some of the others, we also have some Boeing installations that had some positives. And we watch those very closely every year. And again, we do not believe that those are breeding populations at this time.
Another question, do the hairs of the little bear beetles serve a specific purpose?
I'll try to grab this one again. There's nothing in the literature that specifically says what the hairs on that particular species are for. Other similar beetles that are in kind of the same family, the hairs are used to aid with pollination, and in some cases as a defense from mites and other things like that. But there's no specific thing listed for this particular species as to why they have long hairs like that.
All right, again, if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat box or use the raise your hand function.
So, Benton Franklin, Master Gardener, sent me a message directly, but I'm just going to answer it for everyone. That it looked like some of the chemical recommendations had a little red squiggle underneath. I think that is just because of my transferring over. It's because that word is misspelled in Word when I did it. So it's not crossed out. I noticed that on this presentation too. It's not crossed out. It is just simply how I accidentally copied it in formatting. But on the PDF that you all have on the website, it's not. It's just plain looking words. It's just that Microsoft doesn't acknowledge that word of an active ingredient.
A question here, where do Japanese beetle overwinter outside of lawns?
I guess I can grab that just a few inches under the soil in a field, always in soil. You can find them in compost piles, other places like that. Just try to think. I never ran an actual lawn when I was in Pennsylvania, but I can assure you I had plenty of Japanese beetle. So they can actually emerge from fields and other places like that. Generally not in forested settings, though.
I live 2 miles from the Everett Boeing plant. How concerned should I be?
You know what? You should always be concerned. There's a lot of freight that comes in and out of that area. Planes are one of the best ways for this thing to hitch a ride. And there's a reason we put lots and lots of traps there every year, because we know it's a pathway. If you're curious and, have the means and want to run traps on your own property, we certainly encourage that and certainly report in. And as always, you guys are master gardeners. Inspect your flowers, inspect your crops. If you find something that seems out of the ordinary, it probably is out of the ordinary, because you guys are the masters and you should know what's going on out there. So when you see something different, take a minute, document it, report it. A specimen's always better than a picture, but a picture's better than just, hey, I saw it. So don't be too concerned. We're kind of on top of the Boeing thing, but it never hurts to have extra eyes watching our back out there too.
I have a question here. Are local lawn care companies being alerted to this problem and grubber adult control measures for Washington State? I ask because a lot of plant clinic clients are older and may not be physically capable of treating their entire lawns. Washington State Department of Agriculture will be hosting a industry-focused webinar on Japanese beetle the next Monday, and industry growers as well as lawn care technicians are invited to join and listen into that webinar. I have a question here about, are there biological controls for Japanese beetle? Is there anything that eats the beetles?
Ben, I don't know if you want to take that per se. I mean, there are a couple generalist predators and things like that come. And I think there's a couple parasitoids, but normally I would spend a lot of time, and I think I even did in the home hort class, spend a lot of time on how to augment natural predators, and you can minimize chemical controls in that way. In this case, just remember, we don't want to keep this thing around. So, there's nematodes in the soil. Not all nematodes are bad. There's beneficial nematodes. So, and nematodes will eat the eggs of it, but it's not going to help you eradicate it.
And I can add just a little bit to that. Remember, I was in Pennsylvania for 20 years. I can assure you that if there is a biological control agent out there in the general populace, it really only keeps the population low every couple of years, and then the population explodes again. So it's not something that really if there's stuff out there, it's not really keeping it in check very well. Unlike what we're seeing with gypsy moth in the east, where we've seen 5-year cycles go into 10-year cycles because of Entomophoba biomega and some other things that are out there. We haven't seen that with Japanese beetle yet. They still explode every 5 years or so back east, and nothing that's out there seems to do the trick. I will tell you this though, growing up, my job was to go out every day to my mother's rose hedge, pick all the Japanese beetles off the roses and feed them to the chickens. And I can assure you chickens love them. They'll fight each other for them. So nothing specific for a biocontrol program though.
So the answer is you all are the best biocontrol program right now.
So if there's any other questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat box or raise your hand. I don't see anyone with their hands raised.
So do you all have any questions about your rose gardens and your demonstration gardens?
I would actually just like to add just one more thing, because this may come up, and I believe it's already come up with some questions to us on our Facebook group. But back east, obviously, and Gwen has done an excellent job reminding you again and again, our job here is to wipe it out. We're not interested in controlling it. But back east, homeowners will purchase traps as a form of control, if you will. And there's a lot of talk on the internet about traps accidentally bringing them to your area and causing you more harm than good. And that's actually, there's a spot of truth in that. So these can actually get so bad that the bags of the traps will overflow within a day or two, which means the pheromone that you're using and the attractant that you're using to bring them in is still bringing them in, and there's nowhere for the beetles to go. And so that's where this kind of chatter comes from. So if anybody brings it up here, I don't believe we're at that stage yet, and people can very safely hang traps, and it's going to do a lot of good here. So that is something that's come up, and I just wanted to share that with all of you because you may have to answer that question.
I have a question here. When was Japanese beetle first detected in Washington state, and how fast is it spreading?
Okay, 2 questions. I don't actually know the answer to the first one. I know we've had several detections over the years. I believe the first recorded one officially was in the 1980s. But again, these were usually one and dones, if you will. So one of them accidentally hopped on a plane when somebody was loading cargo back east, and then it accidentally hopped out when it got here and stumbled into a trap. So when the first one got here, I don't know. As for what we have going on in Yakima County right now, is we had 3 detections in traps, and then we had one homeowner call in what seems to be a pretty sizable population in the middle of Grandview. We don't know if it's spreading from there at all. That's part of what we're doing this year, is bringing on an extra surveyor to target that area, putting extra traps in that area, getting traps out at our nurseries through our nursery inspection service. And these are, some of the questions that we really do need to get answered this year. But as for spreading, right now we have no evidence that it's spreading. We just have pretty good evidence that we have a breeding population that we're going to do our very best to go in there. And as Gwen keeps saying, the goal is eradication and not slow the spread here. So I hope that answers your question.
Hey, Sven, can you tell the Master Gardeners what's the effort, just so everyone doesn't bombard? There is a rose garden in Grandview. Prosser has a rose garden at the WSU station, and then I know in Kennewick there's another. But what is your activity on working with the Grandview Rose Garden so the Yakima Master Gardeners know what you're doing there?
Oh, certainly. So we've actually been in contact with the municipality, because that one's owned by the local municipality there, and they have actually already agreed to do treatment there this year. And then, of course, we already had surveillance going on there, and we'll continue surveillance in that area. but we're working with the property owner to self-treat there already. That's what you meant, right?
Yep, I know we have a lot of volunteers who are going to be very active, and it's nice to know that what's going on for them so that they don't pursue it also. You guys are doing it.
Okay.
And for us, for our Benton Franklin Master Gardeners and for WSU, I'm recommending you guys put up traps within your demo garden and so forth, and we're going to put them up in WSU's rose garden. But I know that rose garden means quite a bit to you all. So that's the recommendation there.
I have a question here for you, Sven. Do you know if the DNR has been working with landscapers or arborists or urban forestry councils to look for Japanese beetle?
I don't know if the DNR is working on this at all, but what I can tell you is Japanese beetle was brought up at the recent Invasive Species Council meeting, and that includes DNR. So they're at least aware that it's here. But as of right now, I do not believe we are working with DNR in any way on this.
Thank you. Another question here. Given how extensive the spread is in Eastern Washington, is eradication likely to fail?
Well, right now we have 3 beetles and 1 infested property. So I'm not sure we call that, an extensive spread at this point. We'll know more by the end of the season. Eradication has already taken place in Idaho, and a much larger infestation down in Portland. They've been working on that for 10 years or more now, I believe, and that's starting to finally show some signs of shrinking. But I mean, really, if you just look over to Boise, Idaho, they had a really bad infestation, and it took them a number of years, but through a lot of cooperation and hard work, they were able to wipe that out. So I would never really want to throw in the towel, certainly not before we know what's actually going on down there.
Are there multiple generations of Japanese beetle in a year? It sounds like it is only one generation.
Correct. It's just the 1 generation per year.
Will there be a program to provide low-cost traps to citizen scientists and master gardeners?
We're still formulating that. A lot of what we do depends, of course, on funding. We'll be stretched pretty thin. Obviously, we were already doing statewide survey and have to shift gears a little bit here. I know when we've been talking about our response, having some sort of a citizen scientist trapping program is certainly on the table, and it's something we're formulating right now. What that looks like right now has not been settled. I know it is something we've been talking about, though. Our ability to provide low-cost traps to folks, though, is pretty minimal at this point. Certainly, we're through our friends here at Extension and Gwen and the rest of them, making folks aware of what traps are available, and hopefully she'll, be keeping on top of that and hearing from the folks who actually try it out, which ones are working the best, of course. But Gwen, I know you made arrangements through some of the local stores down in Grandview. If you want to share your experience there.
Blyles and I don't have information yet for King County, Snohomish, if there's a local place, but I do know Blyles will, and they are in Yakima, Grandview, Tri-Cities. They will carry Japanese beetle traps. But to be honest, the trap is it's the least expensive part of the entire system. You can get, multiple traps for under $10. The control is going to be more expensive if you find it. So that's the one I really feel like if we have homeowners that are going to apply something, they want to apply the proper thing at the proper time of year, it's really a waste if they treat with the wrong chemical. So just let's be aware of that. But I think, you know, like a trap is $10 or less, depending on where you get it in the bulk, etc. Yes, and they can be found online. Also, it's just there's yeah, if that's easier for you.
So we do still have a little bit of time left for this webinar scheduled. However, there doesn't seem to be many more questions coming in through the chat box. If you have a question, go ahead and throw it in, or also if you're on the YouTube live. But I think it's about time for us to wrap up. And before I do so, I really want to reiterate how much we appreciate the public and master gardeners for taking interest in this and getting ready to report Japanese beetles. I also am going to pause because there is a question, and that question is there a good or best position for the traps?
What did you say was our question, Sven?
What's the best trap placement? Is there like a good place to place it or a good position if you are deploying a trap?
Okay, so I can certainly field this. Generally speaking, we're usually on the edges of lawns or open areas, and you know, you probably want to be, if you're doing multiple traps, at least 20 feet apart. You know, but honestly, if they're in the area and you have a trap with the lure in it, they're gonna make their way over to it more than likely. We line some of the airfields with maybe 20 or 30 traps, just so folks know. But certainly, you know, right in your garden can be a place, near roses. I always worry a little bit about competition with, you know, the natural food source that's there that they prefer. But back east, honestly, it didn't seem to matter. As long as you were on the edge of a field, you were filling up your traps.
Awesome. Just a couple resources again. Our website, agr.wa.gov/beetles, has that homeowner control handout. You can also go to it to report traps, as well as your local Washington State University Extension for control recommendations and things like that. So again, thank you for all attending. If you have any further questions or you need further assistance, feel free to contact the pest program through Washington State Department of Agriculture. This recording will also be available on YouTube as it's also being streamed live now. So again, thank you for attending, and we look forward to hopefully not seeing any Japanese beetle, but if we do, thank you for helping report them.
Thank you, everyone.